Hello and welcome to the Harvey podcast. In this podcast we explore topics of psychology, philosophy, mental health and therapy, as well as the intersections between these disciplines. If you'd like to support the show, please visit the Patreon page. The link for this can be found in the show notes of the podcast. Also stick around to the end of the podcast to hear about more details of workshops, different ways you can support, and upcoming shows as well. Have a good listen. Hello and welcome. On this episode of the podcast, we'll be talking about moral injury. We'll be exploring what moral injury is, how that might present itself in individuals. We'll go on to explore the relationship between moral injury and mental health, and we'll also look at ways of working with moral injury, both on an individual perspective as well as from a clinical perspective as well. Okay, so to start off with, before we can kind of define what the term moral injury means, I think it's important that we define what morals means. I'm going to suggest a weak version of morals and a strong version of morals. Either one of these views of morals are useful, I think, in our understanding what moral injury is. So a weak definition of morals is that morals are a certain code of conduct put forward by a society or group or accepted by an individual for their own behaviour. And then the strong version, the strong definition of morals is that morals are a code of conduct that, given specific conditions, would be put forward by all rational people. There's a weak version there which allows for something called moral relativism, and there's a strong version which is very realist focused, and I'll explain those terms in future podcasts. And a related concept to morals is the concept of ethics. And ethics is a philosophical area of study, and ethics is concerned with the pursuit of rational justification for moral judgments. So morals are these things that exist as codes of conduct, and then the study of ethics is the use of a rational justification for these moral judgments. Okay, now with that in mind, now we have a sort of idea about what morals are. What is moral injury? So moral injury is a strong cognitive and emotional response that can occur following events that violate a person's moral or ethical code. So this violation may occur from an individual to an individual or witnessed by an individual. And this means that there's different layers in which moral injury may impact upon an individual. It can be somebody breaking their own moral or ethical codes. It can be somebody witnessing a breach or a break of their moral ethical code from a group of people or another person. It can also be a person experiencing somebody else breaking their moral codes in the way that they act towards them. So there's different ways in which moral injury can exist and can affect people. Within the literature, it's heavily associated with PTSD, which is post-traumatic stress disorder. However, it's really important that we distinguish that PTSD necessarily involves the presence of threat to have that diagnosis and to have that presentation, whereas moral injury doesn't necessitate the experience and presence of threat for somebody to experience having had a moral injury. And that's a key distinction between those two things. A lot of similarities in terms of some of the symptoms that we'll go on to see, some of the presentations. One of the key differences between moral injury and PTSD is the presence of threat and the necessity of a presence of threat. Okay, now speaking about what it might look like, moral injury often takes the form of people experiencing intense feelings of guilt and shame. There can also be alterations in people's cognitions and beliefs, and specifically these alterations in cognitions and beliefs can be related to how people view themselves and how people view the world around them. People often engage in various coping strategies. These can be things like substance misuse and avoidance of certain stimulus and situations. There's a heavy impact on family relationships and employment. And quintessentially, there's also this experience of existential crisis. So people really starting to question the meaning of their lives, the purpose and their place within the world. Okay, so that's a little bit about what moral injury is and what it may look like practically for somebody who is experiencing such a thing. What's the relationship between moral injury and mental health, mental well-being, or mental ill health? So we've already touched a little bit on this in that idea that moral injury is heavily associated with PTSD. So a lot of the symptoms can feel very, very similar, and therefore the stress experience that people have with PTSD can also be experienced through the experience of moral injury. Although the evidence seems to suggest that there is more guilt and shame presence within moral injury rather than within PTSD. There can also be quite a lot of impaired social functioning, leading to a breakdown in relationships and social support. This can lead to further negative outcomes, such as further substance misuse, suicides, more depression and anxiety-related mental health challenges. And a way to kind of look about how moral injury can lead to some of this stuff, or the function, the system in which this can work, is you have somebody experiencing a moral injury, so experiencing that break or distortion of somebody's moral code, which can lead to impaired social functioning, which can then lead to a lack of social support from people's social network, which can then lead to a higher risk of suicide, a higher risk of substance misuse, a higher prevalence of anxiety and depression. And moral injury, another way that moral injury specifically relates to the mental health is actually within the profession. So moral injury can really be present for mental health care professionals. So people who are working directly with clients who engage in activity that are against people's morals codes. And this can really present a challenge for professionals working with populations who have done what they would term to be morally outrageous things. It can be very hard for clinicians to maintain a sense of empathy and congruence, a sense of authenticness when working with these client populations. So healthcare professionals themselves can experience a moral injury based off of the people they may be working with. And also within the mental health care profession, a challenge that people can face working in this situation is not just working with specific people, but also working within a system that might be engaged in practices that are against our moral code. So working within, as an example, criminal justice systems or even within the NHS in England sometimes, there can feel like there's aspects to that system that go against what people's moral code is. A third sort of way that it can be very prevalent within mental health is that people present with moral injury. People who are experiencing emotional mental distress can come into sessions with their own form of moral injury and never really heard that term before. So being able to educate people on what that term is can be really, really beneficial, while also acknowledging that clients who are bringing in their material based off of ways in which they may have been morally injured may bring up vicarious trauma within professionals themselves. And vicarious trauma is another episode of our podcast. I think it was the first episode, if people want to go back and listen to that for a little bit more information about how vicarious trauma can affect clinicians. Okay, so we've got a little bit about how moral injury may impact upon clinicians and how it may impact upon people in general. I'm just thinking about some ways of working clinically with moral injury. So the research says that a key thing to avoid doing actually, is to avoid exposure-based treatments. So the evidence base that we have says that actually any approach that heavily emphasizes exposure, and exposure is a series of treatments in which somebody is gradually exposed to the experience of something negative in the hopes that it will challenge their thoughts and their beliefs and get them used to being around that environment. But with moral injury, the evidence base that says actually that can be quite harmful for people who have had that experience, and also very impractical to expose them to more as examples of moral injury. Approaches that focus on self-forgiveness and acceptance. A prime example of this is ACT, so acceptance and commitment therapy have shown promising results. Actually, they've shown to be quite promising in the work with people who have moral injury. Thought challenging and cognitive restructuring approaches should be used with caution, as there may be realistic appraisal of wrongdoing. So there's this idea that a lot of CBT approaches in particular will look at challenging people's negative thoughts. So if people are having automatic thoughts about their lives and they have a negative connotation, a lot of CBT, so cognitive behavioural therapy, will look at challenging the reality of those thoughts and challenging the evidence base for those thoughts. However, with moral injury, I think this should be used incredibly cautiously due to the reality that people may have negative thoughts about the things that they've done that may be quite founded. So people may have committed certain crimes or committed things that have broken their moral code of conduct, and actually having a negative thought about that experience is probably quite important for their recovery journey. So actually challenging that thought might not be helpful with those populations. Of course, thought challenging for people who have had moral injury in other ways might be quite useful in terms of challenging some of the automatic negative thoughts that they might be experiencing. A really important finding in the recent literature with working with moral injury is that community engagement is really, really important, and that actually approaches are most beneficial and most useful when they work alongside and encourage community engagement. Research has really found that psychotherapy purely by itself is probably not enough when working with moral injury, and that actually there's something about the community engagement that seems really, really key in helping people to move through their experience of being morally injured. So to say that actually it's important that we have some considerations when looking at the field of moral injury, and some of the considerations that we need to consider more of is that most of the research within this field has been done on war veterans, which are a very unique group of presentations that may not be relevant to other types of moral injury that we may see. So the findings, it's questionable how the findings can be totally generalizable to everybody who's had the experience of moral injury. It is a relatively new field of research, and new stuff is coming out all the time. There's been some more research recently around the COVID-19 pandemic, and particularly around healthcare workers who were on the front lines and may have experienced moral injury related to their roles in that context. But there still needs to be a lot more work outside of the very limited research that we have currently. Again, it's a relatively new concept, as I just said, and part of the issue of this is not only that we lack sufficient data to make generalizable conclusions, but also we lack an understanding of the potential long-term implications. And that's like the understanding of long-term implications in terms of what people who experience moral injury, what their sort of long-term trajectory is, as well as we lack an understanding yet of how psychotherapy or other treatments can help people with this experience in the long run. The term itself has only been around a little bit of time, so we really lack the long-term understanding of both what this might look like in the long run and how the impact of treatment in the long run as well. To some extent, if we take a weak definition of morals that we spoke about earlier, that morals are constructed in some sense by the society and given by the society in which they're from, then I think we can assume that morals are at least in some way defined by culture. This is in itself a very controversial view, but we might, for the purpose of this podcast, we might just say that actually morals can be considered in some way culturally defined. And this kind of indicates that the presence of what is considered moral may vary across sort of cultures, and therefore what may be considered to be a moral injury may vary widely across cultures. So one culture that experiences something as mundane even or everyday in another culture may be experienced as a moral injury. And this can have real implications for working cross-culturally with clients and with populations as perhaps the results of what classifies as moral injury, and therefore the treatment pathway that people go through will vary widely across individuals as well as across cultural groups. And again, I think the theme of what we're saying here, of the considerations that we need to have, is that more research really needs to be done around this. Okay, so in conclusion, a moral injury is a strong cognitive and emotional response that can occur following events that violate a person's moral or ethical codes. It frequently impacts upon an individual's cognitions and beliefs about the world. It has been highly associated with PTSD, although the level of guilt and shame individuals experience mark this as a unique phenomenon. Acceptance-based approaches have shown promise in working with clients who have experienced moral injury, and most of the research has been conducted on war veterans so far. More research is needed to understand the wider experience of people who have had moral injury. Just want to finish with a reflective question. And the reflective question for this week is, how can we systematically address moral injury? So how can we, today we've spoken quite a lot about how we might address moral injury on an individual basis from a clinician working within that space, but actually how can we address the systemic issues that might be raised by moral injury, particularly when we consider the cross-cultural implications that we spoke about earlier. I'd love to hear your thoughts about answers to that question, that being how can we systemically address moral injury. Look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you. Thank you for listening to the show today. If you're interested in supporting the show, please do visit the Patreon link in the show description. There's various different packages involved in the Patreon page, right from just supporting the show to further access to additional resources and access to workshops. You can also visit us on the website hereforyoucounselling.com. That's hereforyoucounselling.com. Again, a link within the show description. If you'd like to book onto additional workshops, there's also a link to the Eventbrite page in the show description. There's a variety of in-depth discussions around lots of the topics that we talk about in the show today. Thank you for listening. Hope you've enjoyed the show.